Hey folks, how we doing? My name is Mr. Peacock. Excited to talk to you guys today about parenting, something that I'm passionate about. Um, as a new parent myself of a 2-year-old who will be 3 in about 2 months, um, I feel like I have a lot of good experience to bring to this topic of development, and I look forward to incorporating that into what I'm about to explain to you all, um, and try to answer as many questions as I can. But before I jump into anything, um, when it comes to parenting, um, there's one word that I like to use for all my parents out there who are trying their best and doing their best, and that word is grace, right? Because parenting is hard. It's challenging. It's frustrating. It's patience testing. Um, all the things that nobody's perfect at, right? And this seems like one of those things, parenting, that we need to strive to be perfect at. And while I agree with that, we need to be able to do the best we can. We're never going to be perfect, and so I always like to start out my conversations with fellow parents with the word grace. And I think that allows us to kind of take a little bit of a breath, um, detach a little bit from this idea that we're going to do it perfectly and our kids are going to be raised perfect and grow up perfect, because I don't think that's realistic. And so I'm going to get into some of the things that we're going to talk about today, and then we're going to jump into it. But like I said, grace. So we're going to discuss a little bit about how parents, how different various discipline strategies that relate to children temperaments. We're going to talk about the developmental stages, specifically, baby to toddler, so on and so forth. We're going to talk about the importance of 0 to 2, and understanding the emotions that are behind that and what kind of fuels and drives that. So let's get right into it. So when it comes to discipline, right, I feel like that's kind of the focal point that every parent thinks about. I don't want to say struggles with, but I want to say thinks about, right? Because as parents, we are supposed to be role models. As a role model, you need to take corrective action when those you're role modeling are not following in the steps that they should, doing the things that they should, and therefore corrective action needs to be taken, or the same type of habit or the same type of behavior will repeat itself. So when we talk about discipline strategies, it's kind of a controversial topic in the parent world, in the sense that there's various different types of disciplines. There's various different types of cultural disciplines. The first thing I think of, as a millennial, is my parents. When I was growing up in the early '90s, it seems as though the parenting now has kind of shifted to more of a gentle approach, more of a emotional approach, more trying to understand your children as opposed to just getting them to do what you want them to do via corrective action, punishment. So we'll dive into that a little bit. And like I said, we're going to discuss a couple of different types of developmental things as well down the line. But going back to the discipline, I think the important thing to understand there is that we're not always going to know what exactly the right form of discipline is for our children, and that's okay in the beginning, because there's a couple different methods to try. And again, going back to that word grace, it's not going to be perfect, but we're going to strive to do our best. So for discipline, you have various different types of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. An example of some positive reinforcement would be, I'll take my young toddler into consideration and use him as an example. Um, if he was consistent with going to using the toilet, for example, during potty training, and he was consistent with that throughout the day, throughout the week. One option there would be to reward that with any various form of whatever your children appreciate, whether it be a treat, whether it be maybe the iPad for 15, 20 minutes. Um, it's your choice, but the idea is that you reinforce good behavior with something positive, so that the child then sees that their behavior is equating to something positive, and so on and so forth. Um, the opposite of that would be the negative reinforcement, which would consist of, let's say, my child used one of his toys to um, hit the dog. Um, an example that I could do would be take that toy away for a set amount of time, therefore insinuating that that was a negative action and there is a negative consequence. Um, some of the issues behind negative reinforcement. Sometimes it can create a level of fear, frustration. You can often see that the child can become easily distressed in these type of situations as they're trying to understand, why was this taken from me? Why was what I did wrong? Um, I think negative reinforcement plays more of a role as the child gets older, as far as its true meaning, and them having time to reflect on what happened. Perhaps an example would be a teenager who did something negative and perhaps had their cell phone taken away. They're capable of understanding and grasping the concept that I did something wrong and therefore I lost a privilege. Whereas, a 2-year-old who just had a toy taken away for something that they don't understand what they did, now we kind of create one of those scenarios where it can have negative effects. So in that regard, I like to think about figuring out, your own temperaments and regulations for your own kids. Things to look out for as far as how they regulate their emotions would be looking for things like, are they self-soothing at all? Anytime there's an emotional response, um, is there any attempt that they're showing to kind of work through it on their own? Are they immediately clinging to one of the essential caregivers? This could be a sign of perhaps, um, a level of attachment. I don't want to go straight to say unhealthy, but there are different levels of attachments as well. And this also ties into what we were discussing when it comes to the attachments and kind of where that starts. So if you think back to when your child was 0 to 2 months, this is kind of the stage where, the instinct to have direct attachment is kind of to all human figures, right? And if you think about that, that kind of makes sense. You've been, in a womb for the last 9 months. You come out into the world, and in those first couple months, there's so many people around you, picking you up, holding you. You don't exactly really know who is who or who to trust. You probably understand that there's, people that you see more frequently, but I think during that stage, it's kind of unknown whether or not they know exactly who to attach to. And then you come to the 2 to 7 month period where that kind of shifts, right? So the focus at that point kind of shifts to, there's one figure that's clearly kind of the caregiver. In some instances, maybe it's two, a good solid split. But there's one figure that the child kind of understands. Okay, this is my caregiver, and I can learn to distinguish who is a stranger, who's not that caregiver or that other person that may be seen, similarly to that. Essentially, they can differentiate between caregivers and strangers at this stage. 7 to 24 months. This is kind of the period where specific attachments will develop. And depending on those attachments is when the child will actively seek contact with the mother and father. And this is where we try to do our best with grace to develop those healthy attachments. Because from 24 months on, this is when a child is now kind of fully aware of their feelings. They use those feelings in order to kind of try and attempt to understand goals, plans to form, all those things and all those actions together before they do things. So if you think about 24 months is still very young, at 2 years old. And if you have a 2-year-old who's trying to think about all these different things before they act, the understanding there, I feel like, needs to be that children need patience, parents need patience, because at 2 years old, when you're trying to factor in all those things that we just discussed, that can take some time. And if that time isn't given, I feel like that can lead to, frustration and impatience, and all things that, we have to we have to adjust. We have to learn to be able to adapt to those things. I know me personally, um, I don't come from an environment where patience is tolerated or accepted. And that was something that I had to work very hard at. Just being open and candid, I wasn't very patient until I had my son, and I had to learn. I had to accept grace, and ultimately understanding how important it is was kind of what led me to realize how needed it was. Because um, as your child is developing, if they're witnessing one of the adults that they are attached to who is not able to control their emotions, how are they supposed to control theirs, right? And it's not always perfect, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every single time I've had an interaction with my child that I haven't lost my patience, because I have. And again, I've said it a lot, and I'm sure it's getting mildly annoying, but I go back to grace, because I don't take one instance of me losing my patience as, this is it, that's game over. I take it as a learning lesson, a focal point to do better going forward, and even attempt to have those conversations with my son. I know that he's young, but I feel like he understands when his dad is able to explain to him, and apologize for, various actions, various loss of patience, able to explain why dad was upset, and why it wasn't okay for him to react in this way. Um, I think that, again, that doesn't happen overnight. Um, I can't say that I had that same type of parenting reciprocated to me when I was a kid. So it's learning a whole different style. It's culture shifting, it's culture changing within your own family dynamics, and it's important though. It's important for child development, as we know now, as opposed to maybe what we knew in the '90s. That's a good transition into, as we discuss those first 2 years as far as attachments, on how those attachments can lead to different emotions, different expressions of those emotions, and different ways to kind of regulate those emotions. It's important that we realize, that there are different levels of emotions, and that we're all not going to have the situation where we have the quote unquote perfect baby who, only cries when it's hungry, or when it wants to be held, and then as soon as you feed it or as soon as you pick it up, it stops crying and has a big smile on its face. Or the quote unquote perfect baby who falls asleep every night at 8 p.m. and sleeps until, a full 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours. The perfect baby who, when people come over to visit, it's in happy spirits and excited to greet people, because none of that is realistic. For those who have had situations where those are the emotions that were given to that your child had during that time period, bless you. I'm grateful for you. I know personally, my son had lots of different emotions during the first, from 0 months to 2 years, that weren't always regulated, that weren't always fixed with a bottle or with holding, or with care from either his mother or I. And it's difficult, it's challenging to understand, and you want to help something that you love, and everything that you're trying isn't working. So back to grace. Um, but some of the things that we can focus on and we can try to understand are various ways that our children express their emotions. And one of those ways is, I would say, levels of frustration. That's probably frustration and pain are probably the most obvious indicators. If a child hurts itself and it cries, then we understand that there's a pain and a pain response. If a child is frustrated with something and then that leads to anger, um, also pretty easy to see. But some of the ones that we may not be able to so clearly, obviously see are kind of the emotional self-regulations that maybe we're not seeing. Maybe a child that detaches and walks away, or maybe a child that's over-attached and is displaying that in ways that maybe we're not picking up on. So there's various different ways that children express their emotions, and it's important to know our own children, know the signs, and do the best that we can to assist them through it. I know one prime example would be my son was not a big fan of sleeping in his crib. And there's numerous studies in other cultures and in other countries where, co-sleeping is very prevalent, and it's very common. Um, on the Western side here in the United States, not so much. There's glaring issues when it comes to the co-sleeping when they're super young in regards to health, in regards to it being dangerous, right? And I fully accept and understand that. And then there's emotional things that are discussed kind of in other countries, that you lose out on that emotional detachment with your kids when you separate them. And so it was something that my son's mother and I went back and forth on, because every night when he would be placed in his crib, it was between 20 to 30 to 40 minutes of just screaming and crying, and just not having it. And the moment he was picked up and put into the bed, he'd be sound asleep. And so 3 years later, he still is a co-sleeper, and it's almost something that I now myself have grown attached to. And so whether or not that's the healthiest thing is debatable, but ultimately I think it's an example, and I share it because it was something that it was taken from my experience. It was an emotional response I was seeing from my child, and it's now an emotional response that we've seen a different reaction to. With all that said, very happy to be able to sit and explain and talk to you guys tonight about childhood development and how important it is. And please remember to keep in mind our key word going forward: grace.